He said he had been listening to a symphony, and it was absolutely glorious music. And at the very end of the recording, there was a dreadful screeching sound. And then he added, really quite emotionally, it ruined the whole experience. But it hadn't. What it had ruined was the memory of the experience. He had had the experience. He had had 20 minutes of glorious music. They counted for nothing because he was left with a memory, the memory was ruined, and the memory was all that he had gotten to keep.
Hello, hello. Welcome to On Books. In this episode, we'll be looking at the second half of the book, Thinking Fast and Slow. That was Daniel Kahneman up at the beginning. And this, you and me, will be joining Mr. Alex Miles Younger to continue our talk about the book. It's going to be a hot chat. Today, the entire episode is devoted to the last quarter of the book, about the last 100 pages, where we discuss this idea of the two selves. Each of us is made up of two selves, and Kahneman refers to them as number one, the experiencing self, and number two, the remembering self. Number one, the experiencing self. That's the self that's the you in the moment listening to this podcast right now. You're experiencing this. You're feeling it. The remembering self, the second self, is when you shut this off and you think back and go, oh, what did I learn? Or how did that feel? It's you reflecting on this. Now, if you've ever listened to On Books before, you may have some remembering selves on past episodes. And I guess if you're listening to this, we're pretty good. Or maybe you have a really lousy memory. I don't know what to say. Something, one or the other. But we're here experiencing this together. And hopefully you're here because you enjoy it and not just because you hope that you're going to get something out of it. I mean, hopefully we do a little bit of both. Getting to the two selves that we just talked about, the experiencing, the remembering selves, we are going to get into much more detail about how memory counts in an experience. Up front, there was that quote that was Daniel Kahneman. He was it's part of his TED Talk, which I'm going to play a little bit more from just in a bit. And that last quote, yes, it's so good. He said, if you remember just from the beginning, he said he had 20 minutes of glorious music and they counted for nothing because he was left with a memory. The memory was ruined and the memory was all that he had gotten to keep. Yeah, I've got some memories I don't want to keep. I don't know what to do with them. They just stay here. Yeah, and often they're surrounded by great experiences. So that's what we're diving into here. When is the experience worth it? The moment being in the moment of now? And when do we do things for the remembering self, for the reflection that we get on it and what we take with it? What we are going to learn is that duration isn't going to be a factor. It's not going to count how long something is. But rather, what Kahneman's going to show us is that it's the best or worst moments. It's the emotional experiences. It's these things that register. So let's kick this off with a little bit more from Daniel Kahneman's TED Talk, where he talks about the two selves. I'm just going to play the first 7 minutes, which I think really just kind of sets it up really nicely. And then you and I and Alex Miles Younger are going to continue this conversation on Thinking Fast and Slow. So grab yourself a drink, some bourbon. I think we're drinking some bourbon and coffee right here. And come join us. Here we go.
Everybody talks about happiness these days. I had somebody count the number of books with happiness in the title published in the last 5 years, and they gave up after about 40, and there were many more. There is a huge wave of interest in happiness among researchers. There is a lot of happiness coaching. Everybody would like to make people happier. But in spite of all this flood of work, there are several cognitive traps that sort of make it almost impossible to think straight about happiness. And my talk today will be mostly about these cognitive traps. This applies to lay people thinking about their own happiness, and it applies to scholars thinking about happiness, because it turns out we're just as messed up as anybody else is. The first of these traps is a reluctance to admit complexity. It turns out that the word happiness is just not a useful word anymore because we apply it to too many different things. I think there is one particular meaning to which we might restrict it, but by and large, this is something that we'll have to give up, and we'll have to adopt a more complicated view of what well-being is. The second trap is a confusion between experience and memory. Basically, it's between being happy in your life and being happy about your life, or happy with your life. And those are two very different concepts, and they're both lumped in the notion of happiness. And the third is, it's the focusing illusion. And it's the unfortunate fact that we can't think about any circumstance that affects well-being without distorting its importance. I mean, this is a real cognitive trap. There's just no way of getting it right. Now, I'd like to start with an example of somebody who had a question and answer session after one of my lectures, reported a story, and that was the story. He said he had been listening to a symphony, and it was absolutely glorious music, and at the very end of the recording there was a dreadful screeching sound. And then he added, really quite emotionally, it ruined the whole experience. But it hadn't. What it had ruined was the memory of the experience. He had had the experience. He had had 20 minutes of glorious music. They counted for nothing because he was left with a memory, the memory was ruined, and the memory was all that he had gotten to keep. What this is telling us, really, is that we might be thinking of ourselves and of other people in terms of two selves. There is an experiencing self who lives in the present and knows the present. It's capable of reliving the past, but basically it has only the present. It's the experiencing self that the doctor approaches, you know, when the doctor asks, does it hurt now when I touch you here? And then there is a remembering self. And the remembering self is the one that keeps score and maintains the story of our life, and it's the one that the doctor approaches in asking the question, how have you been feeling lately? Or how was your trip to Albania? Or something like that. Those are two very different entities, the experiencing self and the remembering self, and getting confused between them is part of the mess about the notion of happiness. Now, the remembering self is a storyteller, and that really starts with a basic response of our memory. It starts immediately. We don't only tell stories when we set out to tell stories. Our memory tells us stories. That is, what we get to keep from our experiences is a story. And let me begin with one example. This is an old study. Those are actual patients undergoing a painful procedure. I won't go into detail. It's no longer painful these days, but it was painful when this study was run in the 1990s. They're asked to report on their pain every 60 seconds. And here are two patients. Those are their recordings. And you are asked who of them suffered more. And it's a very easy question. I mean, clearly patient B suffered more. His colonoscopy was longer, and every minute of pain that patient A had, patient B had, and more. But now there is another question. How much did these patients think they suffered? And here is a surprise. And the surprise is that patient A had a much worse memory of the colonoscopy than patient B. The stories of the colonoscopies were different, and because a very critical part of a story is how it ends. And neither of these stories is very inspiring or great, but one of them is distinctly worse than the other. And the one that is worse is the one where pain was at its peak at the very end. It's a bad story. How do we know that? Because we asked these people after their colonoscopy, and much later too, how bad was the whole thing in total? And it was much worse for A than for B in memory. Now this is a direct conflict between the experiencing self and the remembering self. From the point of view of the experiencing self, clearly B had a worse time. Now, what you could do with patient A, and we actually ran clinical experiments, and it has been done and it does work, You could actually extend the colonoscopy of patient A by just keeping the tube in without jiggling it too much. That will cause the patient to suffer, but just a little, and much less than before. And if you do that for a couple of minutes, you have made the experiencing self of patient A worse off, and you have made the remembering self of patient A lot better off. Because now you have endowed patient A with a better story about his experience. What defines a story, and that is true of the stories that memory delivers for us, and it's also true of the stories that we make up. What defines a story are changes, significant moments, and endings. Endings are very, very important. And in this case, the ending dominated. Now, the experiencing self lives its life continuously. It has moments of experience, one after the other. And you can ask, what happens to these moments? And the answer is really straightforward. They are lost forever. I mean, most of the moments of our life, and I calculated, the psychological present is said to be about 3 seconds long. That means that, in a life there are about 600 million of them. In a month there are about 600,000. Most of them don't leave a trace. Most of them are completely ignored by the remembering self. And yet, somehow you get the sense that they should count, that what happens during these moments of experience is our life. It's the finite resource that we're spending while we're on this earth. And how to spend it would seem to be relevant, but that is not the story that our remembering self keeps for us. So we have the remembering self and the experiencing self, and they're really quite distinct. The biggest difference between them is in the handling of time. From the point of view of the experiencing self, if you have a vacation and the second week is just as good as the first, then the 2-week vacation is twice as good as the 1-week vacation. That's not the way it works at all for the remembering self. For the remembering self, the 2-week vacation is barely better than the 1-week vacation because there are no new memories added. You have not changed the story. And in this way, time is actually the critical variable that distinguishes our remembering self from our experiencing self. Time has very little impact on the story.
So Kahneman talks about this in the experiencing self versus the remembering self, that it's the remembering self that gets that sort of finish at the end,
yes.
And that strong start, and everything else in the middle is just sort of money. So
and you don't remember all the things. Like if you go on a 1-week vacation, it's like if you were to go on a 2-week vacation versus a 1-week vacation, you don't remember. You just remember going on a vacation. I don't know. It's like sometimes it doesn't matter. I don't know. You can't remember if I think about my last trip to Berlin, I can think about it for 25 minutes maybe to tell you every single story, but I can't. Your mind just I was there for a month. You know what I mean? There's only so much your mind can remember.
Well, and this may
you
have
were
to
there
do
for a week of that trip.
I was.
So what do you remember?
I was.
We could probably go head to head and remember the same amount of minutes. You were there for less.
And I think part of this too is about what did you do and how much of that did you spend trying to create memories. I may actually be able to remember as much as you because even though I stayed for a week.
You have a hardcover book. I understand.
The compliments just keep coming. Well, because the week I was there, I was more on vacation, whereas you were there for work, right? So what you did most of the time was go to Beta House, go to the co-working space, and work. And the next day, you do kind of the same thing. So those blend together. Whereas I had very distinct days. I had much more of a memorable week than perhaps you did because, and there was less sort of blending together of it. And, when you set out, this is a fascinating thing that he brings up in the book is when you plan a vacation, like, are you trying to relax, or are you trying to like create the most memories possible? You know, because if you're trying to relax, like, that's great. You could do it anywhere, but like, it's going to there are like two different hospitality industries focused on these two different needs. Some people want to be super tourists, and they want to like capture a bunch of photos because they might not remember it, but if they have this anchor, this sort of this object that will let them remember that moment, they can look through their phone, they can look through their photo album and remember all of those things. They're going to have a much richer picture, and they're going to have a much fuller sort of perception of like how meaningful that vacation was. Whereas if you sit on the same beach every day and you relax, it may do wonders for like your health if you're exhausted, but all you're going to remember is I sat on the beach, right? Like you remember that one thing.
Is that why we're so obsessed with taking selfies? We're like capturing our lives just so we could prove to ourselves, like, because we're going to forget, and we're like, we could point and go, I existed. I had lots of moments I could show you in paper.
Yeah, kind of.
Pixels or whatever.
I mean, it's why like people say like photo or it didn't exist.
Yeah.
That like it's a way to take the ephemeral nature of your life and sort of like anchor it and say, no, that was actually a thing that happened.
Yeah. I also think this is like, I was always so inspired just by like the idea that it's like if something didn't get recorded and it didn't exist, then it like, you were saying it didn't happen, but there's also a way that I think about it as like, then it wasn't meaningful. It's like if if you know that if you've ever looked at people in movies and felt like, wow, their lives are like really together, like Brad Pitt or whatever, he's just like, there's all like he's gonna die and there's gonna be hours of his life that billions of people will view, and like I don't have that, and does that make me less recorded or less copied, into the future?
Well, you're starting to touch on something here that is huge, which is that we ascribe meaning based on its relation to narrative. Again, we go back to that idea that the brain makes sense of the world through story, right? So Brad Pitt lives a much more interesting narrative than you or I, right? He is an international movie star, right? So it's not just that like when we watch him and when we think we know him, because I've never met him in person. Have you?
I've never met him in person.
Right. The only way we think we've met him is through the movies that we've seen him in, which are clearly like fictions, right? Stories which make his character, make him go on these epic journeys, and the change that happens to his character at the end, like it's this monumental thing. He's transformed. And then when we see him in the media, he's again portrayed not as a normal human being, but like in some story of like how this guy broke into Hollywood, how this guy like married, this amazing woman, had these epic romances in his life.
That's
like has all of these families. There's always this narrative constructed around it. So we think, his life is more meaningful. There was a book, we'll find this, put it in the show notes, that Sarah was telling me about, my wife. And she said this guy was writing about story and he knew how important it was. And I believe he'd worked as a screenwriter. And he said, what if I tried to live my life like it was the story of somebody in a movie? And he had this incredible experience because he started putting himself up for risks and challenges that most of us don't take on because it's just not normal. And it's like crazy weird, but it made his life so much more interesting and so much like more meaningful to him. Because
did it? Like, what did he do that made it like jump out of a helicopter on fire? Like, what did he do that made it a story?
I don't know. Okay, I haven't read it, but I buy into the basic sort of concept that if you set out to live your life in a more narrative fashion, your brain, which wants to make a story of things and ascribe meaning to your life through the story, is going to have an easier time if you set it up with all of these experiences that are like designed to be able to tell a good story about it, right?
I think that's true. I think I fairly fall into that category of trying hard/too hard to. I mean, I spent most of my 20s traveling. Like, I mean, I couldn't sit still. I moved to Japan, I moved to Amsterdam, I moved all over. And I think it was just like, you want to live up to this idea of like, you're looking for adventure. I think that things that I was like deathly afraid of when I was 16 became things I chased after when I was like 30, you know? And it was just like, and I would reflect back and be like, wow. And I think that's and maybe I've made up transformations just to prove them to myself, you know. And I think ideally everything you're saying makes sense, but the reality of it's like there are no real stories in your life. It's only a story after you stand still and look back. Like, only can you look back to the past can you make a story, can you construct it out of dots, because you have to leave out a lot of sitting around and going to the bathroom and like walking down the street to like put these like beats of the story together. So to live a story, I don't know that you can, but you can certainly put yourself in like a lot of precarious situations. Like, is that what life's about?
I think it's saying like, I want this thing. I want to be able to say like, I'm a successful screenwriter. And so to tell yourself that story, you write a screenplay, you move to LA, you start to like, you drop into a party where like you're able to give the manuscript to someone. And each of these things is fodder for you to reinforce that story, right? It's you consciously going out and getting the dots that you're going to be able to connect so that you can tell yourself this story about yourself to say like, I am this thing, I am headed in this direction. And I totally agree with you that like, you got to wait till the pauses and you do the storytelling retrospectively.
You do the calculations,
right? That like it happens backwards. And when something happens to you that's outside of that story, you have to revise the story, right? Yeah. So like your story never settled until you die. And then maybe if like something you discovered, if you were a scientist, is like disproven after your death, your story changes even though you're dead. He actually talks about this example where like we feel embarrassed for a scientist who makes a major discovery and then 100 years after their death it's proven to be like utter nonsense and it's wrong, and we're like, oh man, that's sort of embarrassing that like they got it wrong, right? But we think about this narrative structure in such a strong way that it really influences our lives. Have you ever seen the show 24?
Yes, a few.
Okay, so I always wondered what his life looked like on the days that weren't this incredible story. Yeah. Right? So this is a show with Kiefer Sutherland that was on Fox years and years ago, and it was this anti-terrorist task force who's like going out, and each episode takes place in real time and it happens over 24 episodes in 24 hours, and the character like doesn't sleep for an entire day or a day and a half, and he's living the most extreme day you've ever seen. But it was like just one day in his life, right? And it was worth being a TV show just this one day because it was so extreme, because it was so memorable. And the TV show of the other 364 days of his year would be like utterly unwatchable, right? Because they'd just be all these little bits, these going to the bathrooms and sitting and picking your nose and just waiting for something to happen that they get edited out of your story,
That's true. Wow. I hope we're writing good stories right now.
Well, this is what I think, part of designing your life is about. It's trying to get ahead of knowing what story you want to tell about yourself and putting yourself in front of the situations that will give you the opportunity to tell that.
Thanks again to Alex Miles Younger. him and I, we continued that conversation for a bit after the mics went off, and him and I were just talking about our crazy work schedule these days. He has been commuting a lot longer than he's used to, and going to the gym before that, something of like waking up at 6 a.m. And I asked him, I said, how is it that you can push yourself to wake up that early in the morning? Like, it's clearly unenjoyable. Well, for me, I'm more of a night owl. It sounds horrible. And, he thought for a second, and he said, I know that my remembering self will be proud. And I really dig that. I get it. I get it. It's a balance, and being able to recognize it, being able to have that language and understand the choices that I make from reading this book and from having this conversation with Alex, it goes a long way into making myself feel more confident and ultimately happier in everyday decisions. So thanks again for listening. Again, this is On Books. If you like this episode, if you like On Books, please subscribe. You can do that on iTunes. You can do that on the podcast app if you have an iPhone. Also, notes from this book will be on the website, on-books.com, as well as a bunch of other books that we've covered in the past, from Mating in Captivity to the Jim Henson biography to Raina Marie Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. There are a bunch of books on there. There are a bunch more coming. So subscribe, get excited, suggest some books. I'm on Twitter @OnBooksShow, and my personal account's @Castig, that's Castig. My name is Chris Castiglione. Episode editor is Gabrielle Urbina. This music is Birdstar, and the music up front is a remix by Taylor Bentz. It's The Knife and Joanna Newsom.